Masechet Zevachim is Tzadi Chet, 98. We're really moving along. And we actually we stopped in the middle because it was the end of the daf, but we quoted this pasuk, which was, if you want to find the pasuk, is the last narrow line on Tzadi Zayin Amabet of Zot HaTorah, Le'olah, Le'mincha, Le'chatat, La'asham, V'lamiluim, U'lezevach HaShlamim. Right? This is the rule, this is the Torah, these are the teachings for these six different classes of korbanot. We're just getting started, Charlie. So
Thank you.
we asked why we did that, right? What are we teaching us? What does one teach the other? And so we're basically going from one word in the pasuk to the next to say that each karban teaches us something about all the other karbanot. The reason we're really bringing it is because the karban chatat, according to this Tana, is going to teach us that just like the Torah says by a chatat, kol asher yiga b'vsara yikdash, that anything that touches the meat of a chatat becomes like that meat. The same is true by other karbanot, right? So that's the relevant limud for us. But of course, we don't skip to the relevant limud. We go through the whole list. So yesterday we did olah, to tell you that just like an olah needs a kli to shecht it with, a knife, so all the karbanot need a knife. We said mincha, that a mincha is eaten for zichrei kuhuna, so too the other karbanot are eaten for zichrei kuhuna, and we really said all of them we know about, except the one exception was zivchei shalmei tzibor, which are the zvachim that are brought, the shlamim that are brought on Shavuot. This was the only makar that they are eaten by zichrei kuhuna. Asked the Gemara at the end of yesterday, there's another source, and we said there's a machloket tanaim. One Tana learns it from this Braita, from this pasuk, one learns it from another. So now we're up to the second line of Daf Tzadi Chet Amid Aleph, and we're talking about chatat, right? So it says Zot Torah, Ola Mincha Chatat. Says the Gemara's second line, what do we learn from chatat? That mat chatat mikadeshet bibalua. Again, the Gersa is always a little bit confused here, but it should say mikadeshet, not mitkadeshet, because it gives kedusha. It's not passive. It's not the subject, the receiver. It makes something kodesh if it absorbs some of its taste. Afko mikadeshet bibalua. So too, all other karbanot are mikadesh bibalua. And remember, this was a machloket in some extent, but this Braita holds that all other karbanot have the same transference. The next word in the pasuk was asham. What do we learn from asham? It says the Braita to something very, very interesting, which is that we learn from asham that the fetus of an animal is not kodesh. Now Rashi understands that this means that, the Torah says that you're supposed to burn all the fats of an animal. But if, let's say, you shecht an animal and it's pregnant, and there's a fetus inside that animal, you don't have to take the fat from the fetus. I mean, you don't have to take, forget not the fetus itself, but you don't have to take like the kidneys, right? Remember the yoteret kaved, the fat on the kidneys, or the chelev, and burn that on the mizbeach. That's considered to be a separate entity. And until it's born, now once a vlad of a karban is born, it has status of the karban, and you do have to do that with it. But until it's born, it is not considered to be kodesh. And now, of course, how do you know that from asham? The way you know that from asham is that an asham is always a male, right? So since an asham is always a male, there is no fetus in a karban asham. And so we're basically learning something that's a little bit tricky, right? We're saying just like an asham never has a fetus that's kodesh because it's a male, so too other karbanot, like a chatat, which could be female, never has a fetus that's kodesh, right? Which of course is a concept that we call danin efshar, mish'i efshar, right? You learn what is possible from what is impossible, right? The reason an asham is never has a fetus because it's impossible to have a fetus. But we're learning still from there to a chatat, which is possible to have a fetus, that it too would not be kodesh. So I'll read that all inside. Asham, what do we learn from asham? That third line, ma asham ein shafir v'shilya kadoshba. The shafir and the shilya, which are the parts, right, of the, there's a lot of different debates about how to translate these, but we usually translate as the shilya is the placenta, and the shafir, here mine it says fetal sac. I have an English here, but basically the parts of the fetus are not kodesh, and that's because there is no female asham, so there can't be, right? Afkol, so too by other karbanot which could have it, ein shvir v'shilya kadoshba. And the Kasavar, the Tana holds that. What does it mean? The Tana is of the opinion that vladot kachim, that the fetuses or children of kachim, bahaviatan hein kedoshim. Birth, not by conception here. Again, not obviously a different concept, right? But haviyatan, meaning when they actually are born, is when they achieve kedusha. But if a mother is a karban, let's say a chatat, and is shechted, and they find the fetus inside, the fetus does not have the kedusha of the mother because we're danin efshar mish'i efshar. We learn that which is possible, let's say karban chatat, which can have a fetus, from that which is impossible, like a karban asham, which is always a male, and therefore can never have such a scenario. So that's what we learn from asham.
And
Question?
so, and yes, what do we do with the fetus?
You just throw it away. I mean, you get
Throw
rid
it
of
out.
it. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
But the point is that you don't burn it on the mizbeach, right? Because
Right.
at least according to Rashi, this is Rashi's pshat here, that the fats, the chelav of the chatas, for example, usually go on the mizbeach. So you would have thought that you take the fat from the fetus, which certainly, especially if it's a mature fetus, right? There could be a lot of animal there. It's not.
Hmm.
So you get rid of it. You can't eat it, obviously, but you can. You don't burn it on the
You
mizbeach.
don't burn it either. Right. Okay. Thank
So
you.
that is what we learn from Asham. The next case is I'm going to find it somewhere. Miluim, right? It says Miluim, 7 lines down. What do we learn from the Miluim, right? Remember, the Miluim were special carbonot that were brought by the Yimei Miluim when they were being mechanech the Beit Hamikdash. What do we learn from the Miluim? That Ma Miluim motrotem b'sreifa. Just like miluim, Torah says anything that's left over from the karban, you burn on the mizbeach. Ve'ein balei chayim b'motrehem. And there's no ability for there to be a live animal as leftover from miluim. We'll see what we're talking about in a second. Af kol motrehem b'sreifa, ve'ein balei chayim b'motrehem. So too, all other animals, you burn the leftover of the animal, but not living animals. What does that mean? So Rashi explains that by a karban chatat, for example, or shlamim, you can designate two animals, right? You can always say, I have to bring a karban chatat. I'm going to bring one of these two animals. I'm making these two animals sort of for my chatat, whichever one I decide to bring, or whichever one is nicer, because you dedicate an animal, maybe it's young, you don't know which one's going to grow up, etc. You bring it as a karban chatat. But in that scenario, after you bring one as a karban, the second one is called mutar chatat. It's called leftover chatat. And you would have thought that just like the karban chatat is burned, is killed, dies by sreifa, so too you would have to shecht and burn the other one, and you don't. Remember the halacha, which we're going to see more of, is that motar chatat, you let it graze until it gets a wound, etc. But you don't actually have to kill it and burn it like the other karbanot. And the way we learned that from from Miluim is that the Miluim were, of course, a one-time karban. There was no leftover, there was no extra Miluim, right? There was no backup. They just had a karban and they did it with it. So the backups are not treated like the karban, like Miluim. So that's what we learned from Miluim. And the last one is shlamim. What do we learn from shlamim? And remember, it's not regular shlamim, it's shlamei tzibor, is that ma shlamim mifaglim umitpaglim. Just like shlamim, they can become pigol. Remember, they become pigol if you have a machshava when you are shechting the animal or zorik the blood of the animal that you're going to do it chutz l'zman or chutz l'mkoma becomes pigol. And the source of pigol is by shlamim. But they're also mitpaglim in the sense that the let's say, remember, like shalmei tzibor come with kivsei atzeret, come with shtei alechem, right? They come with bread. Other like a toda, for example, is a shlamim that comes with a lot of bread. So the pigel applies to those things too. Meaning, if you have a machshava that you're going to eat or eat the bread chutz lizmano, that makes the animal pigel too. So the additional things to the karban make it pigel and become pigel. Afkol mifaglim umitpaglim. So too other karbanot become pigol and are mitpagel. And Rashi says really the one thing that we're learning from this is the one I mentioned, this Zevachim shalmei tzibur, that just like the bread of the toda is part of the pigel of the shlamim, so of the toda, so too the bread of the shtei halechem of the kivsei atzeret are pigel for the kivsei atzeret. So that's what we learn according to the last word in the pasuk. Now, again, 10 lines from the top, says the Gemara b'matznita Tana. In a Braita, we had another version, meaning we had other limudim from the same pasuk, Mishmei de Rabbi Akiva. And this was in name of Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva, forget about the first word Ola, he didn't talk about, but the word Mincha, he learned from there, not that Mincha is eaten by male Kohanim, but Ma Mincha mitkadeshet bimbalua, just like Mincha, remember it says by Chatat, Kosher Yonagea bivsara yikdash, but it says the same thing by Mincha. Right, I'm going to read. I don't have the pasuk here, but there's a pasuk here. Try to find it. I don't know. I have to find it. Give me a second. But by mincha, it also says that anything that is absorbed by a mincha becomes kodesh. Right. Sorry, let me try to find the pasuk. It'll be helpful. you know, struggling. But to trust me, I'll find it eventually. But by mincha, a mincha also is mikadeshet bibalua, meaning, and we had this in the mission, of course. Remember yesterday that a rakik that touches another rakik, a piece of, how do we translate rakik? A wafer that touches another wafer becomes pasul. So just like it says that by mincha, so too all animals, all karbanot. That let's say you have a shlamim or you have an ola and it touches something else, the thing that it touches, if it gives off taste to that, as we said yesterday, becomes like that. Now, of course, this seems a little redundant because, as we said at the beginning of today's daf, on the third line, second line, that's what we learned from chatat. So why do you need to tell me by chatat that a chatat that touches something else makes it kodesh, and a same thing by a mincha? It says Gemara because they're different. One is liquid and one is solid, right? So itzrich lemichtav mincha, according to Rabbi Akiva, you need to say this halacha by mincha, v'itzrich lemichtav chatat, and you need to say it by chatat. You know why do you have to say it by both? You have to say it by both because. You have to say it by both. It's sorry. It's mincha, it's chatat. Diash mina mincha. Because if we just said it by mincha, that and the pasuk I found it enough as Gemara. Thank you. It's vayikra vav yud aleph. It says kol asher yigab bahem yikdash, which is referring to the mincha, right? So by chatas it says kol asher yigab b'vsara, and by mincha it says kol asher yigab bahem, whatever touches them. So, but you need both sources because iash minan. Where my mincha, if you'd only taught me by mincha, I would have said, well, mincha is a soft thing. It's a liquid, right? Because mincha has flour and oil, so basically it's a dressing, essentially. The ID rachicha means it's soft, it's rach, mivla. So it gets absorbed into other things, right? You mix the mincha with, I don't know, with your dough, it's all going to get sucked into it and get absorbed. So you might think that's why it makes the whole thing like the mincha. Avachatat, which is a piece of meat, emalo. If you only said it by chatat, I would have said mishum de karir. And career is a funny word. Usually it means cold for us, but it's not what it means. Here it means that it's like gel essentially, like when things get cool, right? And so therefore you might think that it becomes very sticky essentially, so that it's very oily and fatty, which it is, right? And it attaches to what it touches, so that the juices and the fats of the animal go to the next animal. Ava mincha im lo, but a mincha, which essentially is something that is not as oily and fatty, it's not certainly not as fatty, maybe not. So tzricha. So therefore, you need a pasuk to tell me both by essentially by the liquid of the mincha and by the solid of, but the solid that's sticky of a karban chatat. So that's why, according to Rabbi Akiva, you need two psukim. Now continues this braita, chatat. What do you do with the word chatat? So this braita does not use what the previous braita did to tell you that it's balua. Ma chatat eno ba ela min achulin. Right? There's a special halacha by chatat, and we'll see how we know that in a second, that you can't bring a karban chatat from an animal that's maaser, right? Let's say you have maaser sheni, right? You have money that's maaser, you have $1,000 at the end of the year. You say, okay, I got to go to the Beit HaMikdash anyways. I'll buy a karban chatat. I'll go to Yerushalayim and shecht it. You can't do that because it has to come from your own money, basically, not from maaser money. And we'll see how we know that in a second. Ubayom, it has to be done during the day. And we know that because Rashi quotes the pasuk by Yom Kippur, right? It says, Bayom hazeh yechaper aleichem. And biyado hayamanit, it has to be done with the Kohen's right hand. And it says the yad, right? We'll see how we know in a second, but it says the hand of the Kohen, especially by Yom Kippur. So af kol, so too all the other karbanot in the pasuk, Eina ba elam chulin. They can't come from maser money, they can only come from chulin. And they have to be during the day, ubi yom, ubi yado yamanit, and they have to be with the Kohen's right hand. Says the Gemara, first of all, before we ask more questions about this chatat min alan, how do you know that a chatat needs to be brought min hachulin, that you actually can't use maaser for a chatat? Amar Chisda, Amar Kot, because the pasuk says, "V'ikriv Aharon et par chatat asher lo." Right, this is by Yom Kippur. Aaron will bring the par chatat, which is his. What do you mean, which is his? Of course, it's his. It's telling you mishelo. No, it really has to be his. V'lo mishal tzibor. You can't get donations. You can't be public donations. That has to come from the Kohen Gadol himself. V'lo mishel ma'aser, and it can't come from his own prior commitments of ma'aser. It has to come from his own cash, basically. And so that is true by a karban chatat, and from chatat we learn to all the other karbanot. So that's one halacha. We also learn biyom, right? That it comes during the day. Says, why do you have to need a pasuk to tell me that all other karbanot come during the day? There's a pasuk that says biyom tzavato nafka. Right, and this pasuk is a pasuk describing all the karbanot. It says, and I can have it here. It says, "Asher tziva Hashem et Moshe b'Har Sinai." Hashem commanded Moshe b'yom tzavatot b'nei Yisrael la'akrivit karbaneihem la'Hashem. Hashem commanded Moshe b'yom to bring all the karbanot. So all the karbanot are included in that pasuk. Why do you need to learn it from chatat? Says, well, you're right. Kidin aspa. You're right. We just threw it in there. Kidin aspa means we just threw it in for the sort of for like the language, not because we really needed to learn from there. So what you need to learn from chatas is that it has to be done from your own karban, and then we added some more halachot, like it has to be done during the day. What about yada yimanit? How do you're saying you learn from karban chatat that every carbon has to be done with the right hand of the kohen? Says, why do you need to learn that from chatat? Need the Rabba Bar Chana nafka. Why can't we learn that out from Rabba Bar Chana? Dama Rabba Bar Chana Rish Lakish. Kol makom shnemer etzba ukuhuna eno el yamin. Wherever it says in the pasuk, we had this earlier, if you recall, that use the finger, or it says a kohen does it, it automatically means the kohen does it with his right hand, right? Unless it says that you could do your left hand, which it never does. But in theory, anytime it says the word kohen, or it says the word etzba, which it says by every karban, one of those two words, either kohen or etzba, it always means yamin. So if that's true, you don't need to learn it from karban chatat. Answer is, well, you're right. The same answer. Kedin aspa. We just threw it in there, meaning you don't. It's true. So basically, we said three things from Chatat. Only one of them was really learned, but we were given a list, right? It has to be your own. It has to be your right hand. It has to be during the day. But the truth is, we would have known right hand and day without this pasuk. Or Yibayit
Before you
Ema.
go on, you can buy a shlamim with Meister Shani money.
You can buy shlamim ma'aseh. So here we're talking specifically in this pasuk about animals that are required for you. Because remember, shlamim is a gift essentially.
That's right.
So yeah, correct. But we're talking here about things that you have to bring that are a responsibility. You can't use sort of double dip to use your master money to do your chiyuv. That's correct. Um, so says the Gemara, the Ibai Dema, there's another explanation that maybe in fact we do need the karban chatat to tell you that every karban is done with the right hand, because Savra like Rabbi Shimon. This bright is going like Rabbi Shimon. The Amar, and we had this earlier in the Masechta, that Rabbi Shimon says, right, that etzba lobai kuhuna, right? That if you say the word etzba, and it says the karban is done with the etzba, that is enough to tell you the right hand. You don't also need the word kohen to tell you that. But if you have just the word kuhuna, it says the kohen does it. If it doesn't say etzba, then ba'i etzba, right? Then you need to say the word etzba because the word kohen alone is not enough to teach you that. And therefore, Karban Chatat, in fact, might be the model for other karbanot where it doesn't say the word etzba, it just says the word kohen to tell you that they also have to be done with the right hand. So it's conceivable that we actually learn something from Chatat about right hand as well. The final words, which are actually not the final words, but the next words, two lines in the bottom, are asham, right? In this second Braita of Rabbi Akiva's Braita, what do we learn from the word asham? Says the Gemara, what we learn from asham is ma asham atzmotav mutarim. Just like in Asham, the bones are mutar, right? What does that mean? Meaning after the animal, remember, Asham can be eaten for one day and one night, right? But let's say after that period, you have to burn all the meat that's left over, but the bones do not have to be destroyed. And that's the chiddush here, right? That the bones are allowed to be kept, and the Kohanim can keep the bones and turn it into whatever you do with bones, a knife or a fork or whatever object you want to make from the bones. So the bones of an asham are mutar. And just like we learn Rashi's lasot mem kelim, right? Now, the question is, of course, how do we know that? So Rashi says he's not entirely clear, but he heard, as he quotes, Rashi loves to say, that it's because they can be eaten for the Kohanim. Right? The Kohanim can eat the meat of an asham. And so that's why we learn it from an asham and not from an ola, right? Because from an ola, remember, the Kohanim get the skin of the ola, but we don't know if they get the bones of the ola. It doesn't say anything about the bones. You burn the whole thing on the mizbeach, but presumably you don't burn the bones. So what we learn from asham is just like in asham, you get to eat the meat of the asham. You presumably get all the parts of it, and the bones don't become puzzle with notar because they're not meat, right? They're just an inanimate object or a non basar object, and therefore, just like in asham, we take for granted that the kohanim get to keep the bones and can do whatever they want with them. So too, by all karbanot, the kohanim can keep the bones and do whatever they want with them. Af kol atzmotav mutarim. So too, by other karbanot, they can do it. And Rashi says even in ola, they can do it with. Rashi's a little bothered that why do we learn this from asham? Why not chatat, right? Because chatat is the same principle. Kohen eats a chatat, and they get to keep the bones, right? So Rashi says that there's maybe another pasuk that we're actually ignoring in this Braita. It says the Kohen lo yiyeh. That's an extra pasuk by Asham. But certainly the chiddush here is that by an ola, which we have no way of knowing this, the Kohanim get to keep the bones of the ola. I don't know what they did with them, but they get to keep them. Amar Rava. Now, says Rava, last line of Tzadichet Amin Aleph, Pshitali, says Rava, it's obvious to me, I mean, I take for granted, that, and before I read the first words on Tzadichet Amin Bet, remember the discussion we've had this whole parak, which we're about to finish, has been about a couple of different aspects, right? One is that if you get blood of a chatat, or we said other karbanot according to some, on a beged, you have to wash that beged, or you have to take that blood out of the beged. We also talked yesterday and before about if the taste of the chatat gets absorbed into the pot or into other meat, that you have to treat it like a chatat, you have to be merak v'shutaf. We talked about all those halachot. But says Rava today, what I am not so sure about is this an issue of bilua, of absorption, or is it an issue of touching? And what would the difference be? So in our terms, the difference would be, let's say you have, I'm sure everyone's seen them, you have those tablecloths that repel liquid. Everyone's familiar with those? Where you spray something on them. So imagine they didn't have that in the Gemara's time, just for the record. But imagine you had something equivalent to that, and basically the dam of the chatat went onto your beged, but it didn't get absorbed into the beged because you sprayed it with whatever that petroleum is or whatever it is that makes the tablecloth not absorb. So what's the example that Rava gave of that was that let's say you have dam chatat lamata, right? Well, this case is easy. You have blood of a chatat that sprinkles onto a beged, and it saturates the beged. And then, which happens, right? The hem of your skirt, of your clothing in the Beit HaMikdash got dipped into blood, right? Then you went and got dam ola on top of it. The dam ola lemala. So there for sure, because the chatat was the first one there, even though it's now covered by other blood, ta'un kibus, you of course have to wash that and clean it the way we talked about the whole parak. Says Rava, that's obvious to me. But what I'm not sure about, Boi Rava, the second line, is what if you have the opposite scenario? You have dam ola lamata, underneath, meaning on the first layer, the clothing got soaked up with blood of the ola. And we assume that no more blood can be absorbed. But then you dipped it into dam chatat. So now you have dam chatat essentially on the outside, but it's not absorbed into the beged, right? So dam ola lamata, dam ola got absorbed first, v'dam chatat lamala, mahu. Do you have to wash out that beged? Now, of course, you have to clean it, right? You can't keep it dirty, but you have to do the special, cleaning that we talked about in our parak inside the azara, like all the details we talked about. Do you need to do that? Do you say it's mishum nogeahu, that the reason you got to wash it when it has a chatat is because the chatat touched it, and here it touched it. Hanaga, nogea, here it touched it. Odilma mishum biluahu, or is it because it got absorbed? The ha lo bala. And here it did not get absorbed. So, the equivalent to my case of the tablecloth, right? It touched it, but it didn't get absorbed. Hadr Pashta Rava then decided, as he thought about it more, it was obvious to him that ein tu'unin kibus. That in fact, you don't need kibus, right? And that the whole concept of kibus is based on the blood of the chatat being absorbed into the baged. But if it was a scenario where, it touched it but did not get absorbed, either because it was saturated with previous blood or in my example, right, some other case, you would not need to do kibus like a chatat. You would obviously, again, take it and wash it, but you wouldn't have to do it in the azara with all the strictures that we talked about in our parak. Now, Amar Rava, on a sort of little bit of side point, as Rava was talking about blood on your clothing, pshitali, right? Remember that it was very often in those days they had to be tovel their clothing. We don't do this anymore. But imagine if a person's clothing become tamei, say in a house of a tzarat or a zav or any case, or even a tamei mate touches clothing, the clothing becomes tamei. You got to go take that clothing and put it in a mikveh. Now, if there's blood on that clothing, it's a chatzitza, right? Just like if there's something on a person when they go to a mikvah, since you don't want it, remember the principle of chatzitza always depends on whether it bothers you that thing is there, right? Because if it bothers you, then it's called a separation. If it doesn't bother you, then it's just part of who you are or what the thing is. But if you have blood on clothing, we assume most people don't want blood on their clothing, right? So, said Rava, pshitali, dam al bigdo chotzetz. If you have blood on your jacket and you put it in the mikvah, that's not a kosher mikvah because you have to wash out the blood first because it's a chatzitza. Unless you're a butcher, right? Because if you're a butcher or a surgeon, as we like to say, right, then it's normal to have blood on your clothing. It's your badge of what you do. You're not embarrassed, right? But the Gemara does not say surgeon. It says tabach, right? Im tabachu, if you're a butcher, then ain't a chotzitz. It's not a chatzitza because, again, you're not putting your clothing in the mikvah to clean it. You're putting your clothing in the mikvah to make it tahor, right? So you don't mind having a jacket that has blood. It shows what your profession is. So that is what Rav has said. And the same thing would be true about ravav. And ravav is a very funny Hebrew word. I don't actually know how to translate it, but it's like thick things. Rush is like wax or fat or I forgot, or things like
It says grease here.
grease. Okay, but so meaning but I don't think it's just grease because it includes wax, which is not really grease, right? But either way, something that is uh thick is the key thing here. That's like sticky and thick, right?
Yeah, yeah. Any viscous substance which melts, such as animal fats and wax. Okay.
Got it. Okay, so you could say those are not exactly the same thing, right?
Yeah, no, 100%.
But that's the kind of thing where you can get stuck on your clothing, right? And so if you have a revav on your big dough, then that's also chotzetz, right? Let's say you're doing the Hanukkah candles and you drip the wax on your shirt, that's a chatzitza. But if you're a mocher revavhu, but if that's your profession, right, then maybe you don't mind showing off that you're all greasy because it shows that if you're dealing with cars, let's say, you don't really mind having the oil stain because it shows you what you're doing. For someone who's not dealing with cars, it's a very embarrassing thing. So if you're a mocher revav, eno chutzetz. And of course, Rava asked the question, which I'm sure is on everybody's mind, which is what if you've got both? What if you have dam urevav al bigdo? Right? Love the Gemara. So if you have blood and grease on your clothing, so do you say, well, one second. Well, it says more, what's the question, right? Im tabachu, well, if you're a butcher, then you might like the blood, but you don't like the grease, right? Typically, mishum ravav, so it's a chatzitza. If you're a mocher ravav, if you're a wax seller, then typically mishum dam. Well, you don't want blood on your shirt. Lo tricha, of course, the case Rava's question was where you have a couple jobs. You're a multitasker. David ha, viha. You have a sign outside that says, butcher, a baker, a wax maker. You do it all. So do you say, one second, even a person who sort of is a jack of all trades, there are limits, right? I could walk in maybe with some blood on my jacket because I'm a butcher, but if I also have grease and mustard and other stains, that's already embarrassing. So do you say, achada lo kapid? One thing is enough. You can have one stain because that's your profession. You don't mind. But atarti kapid, odilma atarti nami lo kapid, it's your profession. You don't even mind if you have two stains. Take them. You're going to have to leave that question unresolved. So hopefully no one loses sleep over wondering this question. Rava clearly was. So anyway, so that is how we end Hadran Alach Dam Chatat. Continues the Gemara now, middle of Daf Tzadichet Amud Bet, a short Daf today. Let's learn the Mishnah. Maybe we'll learn a little Gemara too, because we've got plenty of time. But the next halacha that we get up to in Parak Shnei Masar, the 12th Parak of Zevachim, gets into the question of eating, which we haven't really talked about a lot at all, right? We've come all around everything about what's prohibited and etc. But who gets the karban? So we take for granted, Rashi goes through some of why we take for granted, that there was something called a mishmar, right? There was I don't know how you translate mishmar in English, but a set group, right? That they used to split it up depending on how many kohanim they had, but ideally every twice a year, right? Once every 24 weeks. You would have a mishmar of kohanim. They would be called to duty. It's like jury duty, right? They'd be called to duty, and that would be their week in the Beit HaMikdash. And so during that week, presumably, this is what we're going to say, they get all the karbanot, meaning any karban that goes to the kohanim, all the chatot, all the asham, all the gifts that are given from Mishlamim, even the chazev v'shok, that all goes to the kohanim, right? And they split it up among themselves. The question is, what if a kohen is not suitable? Now, the Rashi points out, actually tomorrow's daf, but we'll say it today, that it's not just the Kohen who does the work, right? It's any Kohen who could do work in the Beit HaMikdash splits into that. And we know that from a pasuk, and we'll see why. But a Kohen who's puzzle, let's say you're a Kohen, but you are not able to do melacha, do avodah. Says our Mishnah now, it's full yom. Let's say you're a Kohen and you're a Tful Yom. Remember, Tful Yom means you went to the mikveh that day. You're going to become tahor when Herav Shemesh happens, when the sun goes down, right? So remember the first mission in Brachot. That's when the Kohanim come in to eat their krabanot, right? Because they went to the mikveh. But during the day, say Sunday, you're not able to work in the Beit HaMikdash because you're still tameh. So if you're a Kohen who's a Tful Yom, or you're Mechusar Kippurim means that you don't need to wait for the night, but you have to do a karban, you have to do an action, like a mitzorah on the 8th day or something like that, where you're waiting to do something, and until you do that, you're not tahor. So you can just do it in 10 minutes, but you haven't done it yet. So at this moment, you are not kosher, you're not tahor. So those kohanim einan chokim b'kachim lechan la'erev. They don't get a portion of the kachim. Now they're allowed to eat it at night, but they don't get a portion because the portions are given out based on who's able to do the avodah right now. And since you can't do it, you don't get a portion. Now, we'll see in a second why. Onain, what about a person who's an onain? And we discussed this earlier. An onain is a person whose family member died, a very close relative, and it's either that day or maybe the night. That onain can't work in the Beit HaMikdash. Remember the whole story about Aaron and his sons dying, and he got to work in the Beit HaMikdash, but the other Kohanim are not supposed to, right? So an onain, he can be nogeya. He can actually go into the Beit HaMikdash. He's not tamei, and he can touch the karban, but Eino Makriv, he cannot bring a karban. You're not allowed to do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash as an onain. The Eino Cholek, Lechol Erev, he also does not get a chalukah to eat later, even if he's going to have the funeral later or not be an onain that night. He still doesn't get a portion since he can't do avodah right now. Now, what about Balei Mumin? Balei Mumin are Kohanim who are tahar, but they have a mum, and they can't work in the Beit HaMikdash at that time. Says the Mishnah, Bein Balei Mumin Ovrim, whether it's a temporary balmum, right? You have broken leg, you're going to get better in a month, or Bein Balei Mumin Kfuim, or it could be a permanent disability. But he's still a Kohen, he's not Tameh. Says the Mishnah, Chokim V'ochlim, they actually get a portion and they get to eat, which is fascinating. So if their mishmar was called, they would come. Of course, you can do many jobs besides the avodah, just because you're a balmum. You just can't do the karbanot themselves. You get a portion, and you get to eat. And we'll ask in the Gemara why he gets it when the other kohanim who can't work don't get it. Aval lo makrivim, but of course he can't do the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Says the Mishnah now, kol she'enu ra'oi la'avodah, enu cholik bebasar, which sounds redundant and of course contradictory to the balmum, because it says anyone who does not roy to do avodah does not get the meat. The chol she'ein lo basar. Now, if you don't get meat from the karban, ein lo ba'orot. You also don't get the skin, right? So it's not just the meat; it's any part of the animal that's given to kohanim, which by most karbanot includes the hide. It doesn't go to this kohen who is not able to do avodah. Afilu tamei b'shat zrikat damim. Even a Kohen who's tummy when they do sprinkling of the blood, but let's say he then becomes tahar when they're doing actual parts of the karban, right? Let's say it's at night. So he's tamei when they did zrika. He spends all night burning the parts on the mizbeach. He comes in the morning and says, I want my chelik, right? He comes at midnight and says, I'm ready to eat now. I've been working for 6 hours. He doesn't get a chelik, right? Again, people can share with him. He's allowed to eat it. It's not like he can't eat it, but he doesn't get a portion. So even if he is tamei b'shat zrikat tamim tahor b'shat hekter chalavim, eno cholek b'basar. Shnemar, it's based on the pasuk that says hamakriv edam hashlamim ve'et hachelev mibnei Aaron lo tiyeh shok hayamim lemana. This is the pasuk we quote. The one who is makriv the blood and the chelev gets the shok hayamim.
So
yeah.
what happens to his portion?
So they just basically divide it. It's like, among the other kohanim.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's do a little bit of the Gemara if that's okay, because we have 10 minutes. We're all good. I'll get a head start on tomorrow. Says the Gemara, Daf Tzaditet, Minani Mili. How do we know this source that a Kohanim who can't do avodah also don't get a portion in the karban, even though at night they'll be able to eat it? Let's say they're tamei and they're going to become tahar, for example. It says Reish Lakish Damar Kra, because the pasuk says the following. It says HaKohen HaMechate Ota Yochlen. The Kohen who is mechate, which means he does the chatat, he does the hakrava, does the avodah of the karban, he gets to eat the karban. What do we learn from this pasuk? Kohen ha-mechate ochel, the Kohen who does the service eats, eno mechate, eno ochel. If you don't do the service, you don't eat. It says the Gemara, is that true? And Rashi says, this is Reish Lakish speaking. Reish Lakish is continuing, Klalahu, is that a principle that I just said? Is it true? Hari mishmara kula. What about the rest of the Kohanim in the mishmar? The ein mechatim, they're not all doing the avodah, right? One Kohen or 5 Kohanim do the avodah. They all are ochlin, right? Again, he takes that for granted. Rashi says it's based on a pasuk, but takes for granted that all the Kohanim get a portion. Says Reish Lakish, again, this is all Reish Lakish speaking according to Rashi. We mean you have to be appropriate to do the avodah. You don't have to do the avodah. You have to be in the list. Again, like it's the jury duty is a great example. You have to be eligible to join the jury, right? Or eligible to be a Kohen, which means you can't be Tamei. You have to be present. It's your mishmar, but you don't have to actually do the avodah. Says, well, that's a good point, but what about a katan? What about a minor Kohen? And this is very interesting because it implies that the Kohanim would show up with their families, right? Because remember, the katan can't do avodah. We're going to see, we know that from a pasuk. But they would presumably bring their children, I guess, if they were able to. First of all, someone had to bring the kids, but they also shared with them and how to learn to do the avodah. So what about a katan? De'ena ro'oi l'chitoi. A katan can't do the avodah, so he can't get you kapara. But ochel, a katan gets to eat. And Rashi goes through the psukim about why we make all these assumptions. But these are all assumptions we make. Ella says Reish Lakish, what the pasuk says when it says yochlena, it doesn't mean any Kohen who does the avodah gets to eat it. It means any Kohen who does the avodah is yichalkenna, gets a portion, right? Eating is not connected to doing the avodah because a katan who can't do avodah gets to eat. But apportioning the meat is associated with the avodah, and a katan does not get a portion. He might eat from his father's portion, but he doesn't get his own portion. So the point is that you have to be ra'oi l'chitoi cholek. If you're appropriate to do chitui, to do avodah, you get a portion. But eno ra'oi l'chitui, eno cholek. But if you're tameh or a katan, for example, and you can't do the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash, you don't get a portion. It doesn't stop you from eating it at night when you're tahar, if you're a katan, anytime, but you don't get a portion. Says the Gemara, that's a really great explanation, but you're leaving out Balmum, right? A Balmum is not able to do avodah. A Balmum is possible for avodah. So how about a Balmum? Hare Balmum. What about a Balmum? De'eno ra'oi l'chitoi. He's not ra'oi to do the avodah v'cholek, and he gets a portion. Says, well, you're right. But a Balmum has a specific pasuk that includes him. Balmum rachmana rabye. The Torah included a Balmum because the pasuk says, and now we quote, Kol zachar b'kohanim, right? It says by Karban that all males in the Kohanim, I'll read the pasuk, Ish asher yeh bo mum. No, where am I? I read the wrong pasuk. Kol zachar b'kohanim yochaloto. Every zachar b'kohanim can eat the Karban. Kodesh kodeshim hu. So the pasuk is basically adding with kol zachar b'kohanim that even someone who would have been excluded, say a balmum, is included. The rabot balmum. Says, well, I like that drasha, but how do you know it means a balmum? Ema kol zachar rabot full yom. Right? You said in our Mishnah that if you can't do the avodah, you don't get a portion. But the pasuk says kol zachar to include somebody else. How do you know to include balmum and not to include a tamei person who's going to be tahar on that night? Answers the Gemara Mistavra, it makes more logical sense that balmum havilei the ribuye, that you should add a balmum shkin ochel because he can eat from the karban because he's not tamei, right? So Tvul Yom can't eat. Says Gemara Adarab, but Tvul Yom havilei the ribuye dil orta michse chazi. Right? At night, the Tvul Yom is going to be a perfectly normal Kohen. The Balmum is going to be a Balmum at night. So how answers the Gemara, but it doesn't matter. We go with immediate gratification. Hashtamia halochazi. At this moment, a Balmum is a Kohen who can eat. He can't do avodah, but he can eat. A Tvul Yom is a Kohen who's tamei, so he can't eat. And therefore, we go with where it is right now. And I'm going to read, I'm sorry if I'm doing too much of the daf, but I want to just get to the two dots. Rav Yosef says, look, I've got another explanation of the pasuk because Michti, you explained that it says instead of when it says kol zachar, it says kohen mechateo to yochlena. It doesn't mean the kohen eats it. It means he gets yichalkena. He gets a portion. My yochlena, you said meant yichalkena. Well, if that's what the Torah means, why doesn't it just say that? Lichtev rachmani yichalkena. My yochlena. So why does it say yochlena? Shma mina ro'oi lachila cholek shen ro'oi lachila ino cholek. So the whole reason it says yichalkena, it says yochlena instead of yichalkena is to tell you that really we're talking about giving out portions of the karban. But we say it in a verb of eating to tell you that someone who can eat the karban right now, meaning a balmum, who although he can't work in the Beit HaMikdash is perfectly tahor, he gets a portion. So basically, the Torah says anyone who does the avodah gets a portion. And then we have one extra pasuk says kol zachar b'kohanim, somebody else too. How do we know who to include? Because it's expressed yochlena instead of yichalkena, it tells you those things are connected, and a kohen who's a balmum gets a portion, and a kohen who's tamei does not get a portion. We will stop there, a little further ahead, but hopefully a good head start for tomorrow. Shkoach again, everyone. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov and Chanukah Sameach.
And to you
all
and
good
everybody
things.
else.
All good things. Safe
Special
trips.
brew.
Bye.